The courtroom was silent, save for the rhythmic tapping of a pen against the polished oak desk. Judge Matthew Crane, known for his no-nonsense demeanor and sharp intellect, glanced over the papers before him. His reputation for delivering swift and unyielding justice had earned him both admiration and resentment over the years. Yet, beneath the surface of his austere exterior was a man deeply committed to upholding the law. Today, however, the weight of his gavel was about to carry consequences far beyond anything he had ever anticipated. The case seemed straightforward on paper, a minor traffic violation. The defendant, a young black woman named Camille Hayes, stood at the defendant's podium. Her poise and calmness were striking, even under the scrutiny of the court. Dressed in a professional suit, she exuded a quiet confidence that contrasted sharply with the anxious energy typical of those called to face Judge Crane. From his elevated bench, Matthew adjusted his glasses and addressed her with measured authority. "Miss Hayes, you've been charged with reckless driving in a school zone. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Camille replied, her voice steady but firm. Her eyes locked with his, unwavering. For a moment, Matthew was taken aback, not by the response itself, but by an uncanny sense of familiarity that he couldn't quite place. Shaking off the fleeting thought, he returned to the procedural task at hand. The prosecutor presented their evidence, a dashcam recording showing a vehicle speeding past the school during early morning hours. Camille didn't flinch as the video played. She stood rooted, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression unreadable. When it was her turn to speak, Camille approached the bench with a kind of deliberate grace that commanded attention. "Your Honor," she began, "I'd like to request a moment to clarify the circumstances of this alleged violation." Matthew leaned forward slightly, intrigued. Her tone wasn't defensive or accusatory. It was measured, almost conversational. It was clear she wasn't intimidated by the court's formalities or by him. The courtroom murmurs faded as everyone focused on the unfolding interaction. But as she laid out her reasoning, something shifted in Matthew. Her voice carried a resonance that pulled at a buried memory. He studied her more closely now, the curve of her face, the way she enunciated her words, the faint lilt in her tone. And then, as if struck by lightning, realization began to dawn. He couldn't pinpoint it yet, but a shadow of recognition loomed large in his mind. Who was this woman? Camille, seemingly unaware of his internal struggle, continued with her statement. "Your Honor, I believe the evidence presented doesn't account for critical details that may exonerate me. I've submitted supporting documents, including timestamps and witness testimonies, for the court's review." Matthew cleared his throat, attempting to mask the confusion creeping into his usually composed demeanor. "I'll review the materials. In the meantime, is there anything else you wish to add?" "Yes," she said, a faint smile breaking through her otherwise serious expression. "I'd like to remind the court that justice isn't just about punishment. It's about understanding the truth." Her words hung in the air, striking a chord with everyone present. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, and even the clerk paused mid-typing to glance up at her. Matthew, however, felt the weight of her statement on a deeper level. He couldn't shake the growing unease, the sense that this case, this woman, wasn't just another entry in his docket. As the session concluded and the courtroom emptied, Matthew remained seated at the bench, staring at the now vacant defendant's podium. His mind raced through the possibilities. Who was she, and why did she feel so familiar? Unbeknownst to him, the answers lay not in the court records or the evidence folder, but in the fabric of his own life. A connection hidden in plain sight, waiting to unravel in ways he could never have foreseen. As Judge Matthew Crane sat in his chambers later that evening, the events of the day continued to swirl in his mind. The courthouse was silent now, the usual hum of clerks and attorneys replaced by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. He had presided over countless cases during his career, some far more complex than Camille Hayes' traffic violation. Yet something about this one refused to let him rest. That nagging sense of recognition gnawed at him, tugging at memories he couldn't fully grasp. He opened Camille's file again, his eyes scanning over the details. Age, 29. Occupation, listed as consultant. Address, an upscale part of town. Nothing jumped out immediately as unusual. The evidence submitted earlier, a neatly organized packet of receipts, GPS logs, and witness statements, lay untouched beside the file. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story, more than she had let on in court. Matthew leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, letting his thoughts wander. Her voice echoed in his memory. The cadence, the confidence. It was rare for a defendant to hold their ground like that, especially in his courtroom. But it wasn't just her poise that stood out. It was something else, something deeply personal, though he couldn't put his finger on it. Meanwhile, Camille sat in her modest apartment, a glass of tea in hand, staring out the window at the city lights. Her day in court had gone as expected, though the look on Judge Crane's face during their exchange lingered in her mind. She had noticed his momentary hesitation, the way his eyes narrowed as if trying to place her. It wasn't unusual for people to underestimate her, but today felt different. There was an air of familiarity in his expression, a flicker of something unspoken. Camille's phone buzzed, breaking her train of thought. It was a text from her colleague Erica. Asterisk, how did it go? Did the judge give you a hard time? Asterisk. She smiled faintly and typed back, asterisk not yet, but he's curious. I can tell. Asterisk. Erica replied almost instantly. Asterisk, well, he should be. He has no idea what's coming. Asterisk. Camille set the phone down, a smile fading. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The court case was only a small piece of the larger puzzle she was trying to solve. There was a reason she had chosen this specific judge, this specific moment, to push forward. Timing was everything, and so far, things were unfolding according to plan. Back in his chambers, Matthew finally decided to call it a night. But as he gathered his things, his gaze fell on an old photograph tucked into the corner of his desk drawer. It was from nearly a decade ago, taken during a celebratory dinner with a group of junior colleagues at the district attorney's office. In the center of the picture stood a young man who looked just like him, confident, proud, and ambitious. His mind flickered to that time in his life, when the cases were smaller, the stakes lower, and his mistakes fewer. That was before everything had changed. Matthew shook off the thought and locked up his office, but as he drove home through the quiet streets, his thoughts kept circling back to Camille. Who was she really? Why did she feel like a missing piece of a story he hadn't finished reading? The next morning, Matthew arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual, determined to get a head start on his review of her case. He instructed his clerk to gather any additional public records about Camille Hayes. He justified the request as routine, but deep down, he knew it was driven by his own curiosity. As the hours passed, a clearer picture began to emerge. Camille was no ordinary defendant. She held a master's degree in public administration and had worked with various government and non-profit organizations. Most recently, she had been a senior advisor at the Office of Judicial Ethics, a detail that stopped Matthew cold. His mind raced as he processed the implications. The Office of Judicial Ethics oversaw reviews of judicial conduct, and if she had worked there, she could potentially hold influence over his career. But why would someone in such a position end up in his courtroom over a traffic violation? His train of thought was interrupted by the arrival of his clerk, who handed him a folder containing more records. Matthew flipped through it, his heart sinking as he stumbled across a name he hadn't expected to see, Donovan Crane. Donovan was Matthew's estranged brother, a man whose life had taken a darker path. The two hadn't spoken in years, their last interaction a bitter argument that had left scars too deep to heal. But what did Donovan have to do with Camilla? Matthew's stomach churned as he read further. Donovan had been involved in a legal dispute several years ago, one that had ended abruptly with no public explanation. The plaintiff in that case? A young woman named Camille Hayes. The realization hit Matthew like a tidal wave. This wasn't just a random case. This was personal. Camille had a history with his family, and for reasons he couldn't yet fathom, she had walked into his courtroom deliberately. She had planned this. Across town, Camille sat in a bustling cafe, a laptop open as she reviewed her notes. She had anticipated that Matthew would dig into her background. It was part of the reason she had been so meticulous in preparing her case. Every piece of evidence, every statement, had been crafted to withstand scrutiny. She wasn't here to simply clear her name over a minor charge. She was here to confront a history that had remained buried for far too long. She thought back to Donovan Crane, a man she had once trusted, only to have that trust shattered in the worst possible way. The legal battle she had fought against him years ago had left her disillusioned, not just with him but with the entire system. And now, as fate would have it, she had crossed paths with his brother, a man who represented everything she had once believed in, only to discover how fragile that belief could be. As the pieces of the puzzle began to align, the stakes grew higher. For Matthew, the case was no longer just about upholding the law. It was about protecting his career, his reputation, and perhaps even his family's secrets. For Camille, it was about justice, not the kind found in a courtroom, but the kind that comes from uncovering the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Neither of them knew just how deeply their lives would become entangled in the days to come, or how the search for answers would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. For now, the tension hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable, as the next chapter of their story waited to unfold. As Judge Matthew Crane walked into the courtroom the following day, his expression was carefully composed, but beneath his calm exterior, his thoughts were in turmoil. Camille Hayes wasn't just a defendant. She wasn't just an advisor with a distinguished resume. She was someone who had crossed paths with his family in a way that could expose wounds he thought had long since scabbed over. Yet she stood before him, poised, calculated, and with a purpose he still couldn't fully discern. The question gnawed at him. Was her appearance in his courtroom a coincidence, or was it something more? The courtroom was unusually crowded for what should have been a mundane case. Perhaps word had spread about Camille's confident demeanor, or the palpable tension between her and the judge. As the proceedings resumed, Matthew's voice was steady, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the usual balance of power in his courtroom had shifted. Camille wasn't intimidated by him, and that unnerved him in ways he wouldn't admit. Camille, for her part, remained composed. She knew the court was no longer just a venue for her defense. It had become a stage. Her meticulous preparation had ensured that every piece of evidence she submitted was airtight. She was playing a longer game. Her true purpose here wasn't simply to contest a traffic violation. It was to confront Matthew Crane and the legacy of his family. As the prosecution began questioning witnesses, Matthew found his attention drifting. His thoughts returned to Donovan. The man had always been reckless, taking shortcuts and making enemies, but Matthew had kept his distance. He had prided himself on being the opposite of his brother, a man of principle, a pillar of the legal system. Yet now, Donovan's shadow loomed large over his courtroom, and Matthew was powerless to ignore it. The tension in the room grew as Camille took the stand. The prosecutor's questions were straightforward, designed to establish facts, but Camille's responses carried a weight that hinted at deeper truths. Each answer was measured, revealing just enough to address the immediate question, while leaving threads dangling, threads that begged to be pulled. "Miss Hayes," the prosecutor asked, "can you confirm that you are the registered owner of the vehicle in question?" "Yes," Camille replied, her tone calm. "But ownership doesn't confirm who was driving at the time." Matthew's eyes narrowed. Her words were precise, almost rehearsed. She wasn't just defending herself, she was steering the narrative. "And can you explain why your vehicle was in the school zone during those hours?" The prosecutor continued. Camille hesitated just for a moment before responding. "I was on my way to meet someone I trusted to help resolve a personal matter." Her eyes flicked briefly toward Matthew, and for a split second he felt as though the entire courtroom had turned to look at him. The prosecutor pressed further, but Camille's answers remained consistent, her calm demeanor unshaken. When the questioning concluded, she stepped down from the stand, her gaze briefly locking with Matthew's as she returned to her seat. There was no malice in her expression, but there was something else: resolve. After the day's session ended, Matthew retreated to his chambers, determined to dig deeper into Camille's past. He pulled out the records his clerk had gathered and began piecing together her story. What emerged was a portrait of a woman who had faced systemic injustices, yet refused to be silenced. Her legal battle with Donovan Crane had been more than just a personal grievance. It had been a stand against corruption, a fight to expose truths that others had tried to bury. But the case had ended abruptly, and Matthew now realized why. Donovan had pulled strings, exploited connections, and ensured that the matter was quietly swept under the rug. But Camille hadn't forgotten. She hadn't forgiven. And now it seemed she had found a way to make her voice heard again. That evening, Matthew drove to a quiet bar on the outskirts of town. He needed to think, to process what he had learned. As he nursed his drink, a familiar figure slid into the seat across from him. It was Erica, Camille's colleague. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, her tone light, but her expression serious. Matthew stared at her, unsure how to respond. "Who are you?" "Someone who knows more than you think," Erica replied, her voice steady. "And someone who's not here to cause trouble." Yet, Matthew leaned back, his mind racing. Erica's presence was unexpected, but her words carried weight. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand," she said, "that Camille isn't here to destroy you. She's here to make things right." Matthew frowned. "And what does that mean?" "It means," Erica said, leaning in, "that the choices you make in the coming days will determine whether you're part of the solution or just another obstacle." She stood up, leaving Matthew alone with his thoughts. Her words echoed in his mind as he drove home, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and white. For the first time in his career, he felt truly unmoored, uncertain of what lay ahead. The next day in court, the atmosphere was tense. Camille presented her final evidence, a detailed timeline that contradicted the prosecution's case. The documents were flawless, but it wasn't just the facts that held the room's attention. It was the way she delivered them. Her confidence, her precision, her undeniable presence. It was clear she wasn't just defending herself. She was making a statement. As the session ended, Matthew lingered in the courtroom, watching as Camille gathered her things. She glanced up, catching his gaze, and for a moment, neither of them looked away. There was no animosity in her expression, only determination. Matthew knew the conflict between them wasn't just about the case. It was about something deeper. Truths buried in the past, choices that had led them both to this moment. And as he watched Camille walk away, he realized that the answers he sought wouldn't be found in court records or legal briefs. They would be found in the conversations he had avoided, the truths he had refused to confront. The story was far from over, and Matthew knew that the coming days would test everything he thought he knew about justice, family, and himself. The question was, would he rise to the challenge, or would the weight of his own history drag him down? The courtroom buzzed with energy as the trial entered its final stages. Matthew Crane sat at the bench, his usually impassive face betraying the weight of the mounting tension. Camille Hayes, seated at her table, radiated a quiet determination, her every move calculated. Her lawyer, though competent, seemed content to follow her lead, a clear testament to Camille's meticulous control of the narrative. The prosecution tried to regroup, presenting their closing arguments with fervor, but the cracks in their case were evident. Camille's evidence, her composure, and the subtle implications of her connections had tilted the balance. The once strong foundation of their accusations had begun to crumble, and everyone in the room felt it. The jury's faces were inscrutable, but their focused expressions betrayed their engagement with the unfolding drama. Matthew's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The revelation about Donovan's role in Camille's past had shaken him deeply. Every word, every piece of evidence she presented felt like a direct challenge to his integrity, even though she never addressed him directly. Her presence alone was a reminder of the complexities he had long tried to ignore. Midway through the session, a dramatic twist caught everyone off guard. Camille requested to submit a sealed document, one she claimed was crucial to understanding the broader context of her case. The prosecutor objected vehemently, but Camille, calm as ever, stood firm. Her lawyer presented a compelling argument about the relevance of the document, citing precedent and urging the court to allow its submission. Matthew hesitated. He knew he had to appear impartial, but the decision weighed heavily on him. Allowing the document could unravel truths he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Denying it could erode his credibility and deepen the unspoken tension between him and Camille. After a moment that felt like an eternity, he nodded, permitting the submission. As the bailiff delivered the document to Matthew's bench, the courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Matthew opened the envelope, his hands steady despite the turmoil inside him. What he read made his blood run cold. It was a meticulously detailed report, outlining a network of corruption that implicated Donovan directly. More alarming, it hinted at institutional failings that extended to the judicial system itself. While Matthew's name wasn't mentioned, the implications were clear. He was tied to the legacy of a deeply flawed system, one that Camille was determined to expose. The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers as Camille, ever composed, addressed the court. "This isn't just about me or a traffic violation," she said, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "This is about accountability, about ensuring that those in power cannot act with impunity." Her words hung in the air, charged with an energy that seemed to ripple through everyone present. Matthew felt the weight of her gaze, even as she spoke to the jury. The tension was palpable, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. As the day's proceedings came to a close, Matthew lingered in his chambers, staring at the document before him. He knew the storm that would follow its revelation. Donovan's actions were indefensible, and the connections Camille had unearthed would send shockwaves through the legal community. But what troubled Matthew most was his own role in the system Camille sought to dismantle. While he had always prided himself on his integrity, he couldn't ignore the uncomfortable truth. By turning a blind eye to certain realities, he had become complicit. That evening, Matthew made a decision. He picked up his phone and dialed Donovan. The call went straight to voicemail, but Matthew left a message anyway, his voice laced with uncharacteristic urgency. "We need to talk. Now." Meanwhile, Camille sat in her modest apartment, surrounded by files and documents. Erica sat across from her, a silent pillar of support. "You did well today," Erica said softly. Camille nodded, but her expression remained serious. "It's not over yet. Not until the truth is out." Erica leaned forward, her eyes steady. "And if the truth drags him down too?" Camille hesitated, the question hanging in the air. She had spent years preparing for this moment, years fighting for justice. But now, as the climax of her journey approached, she couldn't ignore the complexities of her choices. Matthew Crane was not Donovan. He had not committed the crimes she sought to expose. Yet he was a part of the system that had enabled them, and that she knew was a truth he would have to face. The following morning, the courtroom was packed. The tension was electric, every person present keenly aware that the day's events could change everything. As Camille prepared to take the stand once more, Matthew took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The climax was near, and the choices they made in the coming hours would determine not just the outcome of the trial, but the course of their lives. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting slanted shadows over the courtroom as Camille Hayes stood, ready to deliver her most crucial testimony yet. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, every eye locked on her. Matthew Crane adjusted his robe at the bench, outwardly calm, but inwardly bracing himself. He couldn't shake the feeling that something unexpected was about to unfold. Camille began with a measured tone, recounting events that had, until now, only been hinted at. She spoke about the systemic barriers she had faced, the abuse of power she had witnessed, and the painstaking journey she had undertaken to bring the truth to light. Her words painted a vivid picture, and the jury hung on to every syllable. But just as the narrative seemed to be reaching its peak, she paused, her gaze sweeping the room. Then she dropped the bombshell. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, but charged with intensity, "there is one final piece of evidence I need to submit. Evidence that connects this case to something far larger than anyone here may have anticipated." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Matthew leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice firm, but not unkind, "if you have additional evidence, it must comply with procedural rules. Please explain its relevance." Camille stepped closer to the podium, holding up a small black USB drive. This drive contains records that not only implicate Donovan Crane, but also expose a network of individuals who have exploited their positions for personal gain, individuals within the judiciary and law enforcement. The courtroom erupted. The prosecutor immediately objected, claiming the evidence was inadmissible without prior disclosure. Camille's lawyer countered, citing whistleblower protections and the extraordinary relevance of the material. Matthew raised his gavel, calling for order, but his voice barely rose above the commotion. The tension was almost unbearable as Matthew deliberated. He could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, especially Camille's. Allowing the evidence could upend everything, potentially implicating people he worked with and trusted. Denying it could undermine the very principles he had sworn to uphold. Finally, he made his decision. "The court will allow the evidence," he declared, his voice cutting through the noise. "But its contents will be reviewed in chambers before presentation to the jury." As the courtroom emptied for a recess, Camille handed the drive to the bailiff with a calm confidence that seemed to rattle even the most seasoned observers. Matthew retreated to his chambers, where he plugged the drive into his laptop. What he saw left him stunned. The files were exhaustive: emails, bank transactions, surveillance footage. The names listed included prominent figures in the legal system, individuals Matthew had worked alongside for years. Donovan's role was unmistakable, but the breadth of the corruption was staggering. It wasn't just about Camille's case anymore. It was about an entire system built on compromised ethics. Matthew's heart pounded as he considered his next steps. This wasn't just a courtroom drama anymore. It was a moral crossroads. Exposing the contents of the drive could destroy careers, ruin reputations, and destabilize the very institution he had devoted his life to. But withholding it would mean becoming complicit in the corruption Camille was fighting against. Meanwhile, in the hallway outside the courtroom, Camille waited, her expression unreadable. Erica joined her, her voice low. "Do you think he'll do the right thing?" Camille didn't answer immediately. "I think he's struggling," she said finally. "But struggle means that there's still a part of him that cares about justice." Back in his chambers, Matthew was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was his clerk, looking unusually nervous. "Your Honor," she said, "you have a visitor." Before he could respond, Donovan Crane stepped into the room, his face a mask of forced confidence. "Matthew," he said smoothly, "we need to talk." Matthew's jaw tightened. "You have no business here, Donovan." "Oh, but I do," Donovan replied, his tone dripping with feigned sincerity. "You're about to make a decision that could change everything. For you, for me, for the entire judicial system." Matthew stood, his voice rising. "And whose fault is that? You made your choices, Donovan. Now it's time to face the consequences." Donovan's smirk faltered. "Don't be naive, Matthew. If this goes public, it won't just be me who falls. They'll dig into everything, every case, every ruling, and you'll be guilty by association." Matthew's chest tightened, but he held his ground. "I spent my entire career trying to do what's right. Maybe it's time the system faced the truth, no matter the cost." Donovan's eyes narrowed, his tone turning sharp. "Don't be a martyr, Matthew. You're not as clean as you think. Remember, the system you're so eager to defend is the same one that kept you in power." The words struck a nerve, and for a moment Matthew faltered. But then he thought of Camille, her courage, her relentless pursuit of justice. He thought of the jury, the people in the courtroom, and the trust they placed in him to uphold the law. As Donovan left, the weight of Matthew's decision settled over him. The next time he stepped into that courtroom, everything would change. The question was, would he stand on the side of truth, or would he let fear dictate his path?